So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this Accessibility Lunch and Learn today, part 2 of Accessible Signage and Wayfinding with Allison Maas and Kelsey Walker from Eye Candy Signs. I'm Julie Glazer, the manager for the Accessibility, Equity, and Anti-Racism program for the Association of Municipal Administrators of Nova Scotia. This program is funded by the Province of Nova Scotia's Department of Justice through the Accessibility Directorate to help meet the province's accessibility goals by 2030 with support to municipalities through training, education, tools, and resources. I'm pleased to welcome back Allison and Kelsey. Allison is the wayfinding partner at Eye Candy Signs, and Kelsey is the lead accessibility designer. Allison and Kelsey are both RHFAC professionals and collaborate on accessibility projects across Canada. Allison sits on the Accessibility Standards Committee of Canada and was also a member of the Nova Scotia Accessibility Directorate's Committee for the Built Environment. So very pleased to welcome you both again today, and I will pass this over to you.
Thanks so much. Excuse me. So I'll reintroduce myself. I am Allison, wayfinding partner at Eye Candy. Eye Candy is a wayfinding specialized sign company in Halifax. We work with architects, engineers, facility managers, small businesses even, across North America. And our interest, Kelsey and I both personally as well as professionally, is making the world a barrier-free environment. So it's a personal pursuit as well as something that we really work hard on every day. So I'm Allison. This is Kels.
Hello, hello.
My pronouns, if you need to use them, are she, her.
And I'm he, him.
I'm going to try and share my screen. I always have a hard time moving between Zoom and, excuse me, and what's the other one that I use? Microsoft.
Yeah, Teams.
I can't even remember what they're called. So just give me a second while I find the right screen. And I'm going to need some help as well, just making sure that I've got the right one up because I have multiple screens here in front of us. So if you can confirm, you see my first slide, which is a photograph of Kelsey and myself.
Yes.
Yep. Great. Okay. Awesome. So we will start with our slide. I kind of feel a little bit cheeky starting with only so few people in the room. Do you think we should start with our
We can,
sample?
Sure. We can talk about the sample or...
All right. Can you guys just confirm? And again, because we're doing the shared screen, we don't have an eye on you. We can't see who's in the room anymore. But can you confirm, can you see us as well as our presentation?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about this. So thank you to everyone who sent their address in with a request for a sample. We sent them off last week, so hopefully everyone's got their sample. Actually, I think we sent them off on Monday.
Top of this week, yeah.
Yeah. What I'm holding here is a sample that we've sent. I think we sent out, was it 40 total?
Yeah.
And it shows across this side here 3 different ways of producing Braille. So hoping that you can see a sheen or a change of reflection on the top sign here. This is a shiny.
Oh, hang on one second, Allison. I'm sorry. Yeah. Folks can only see the presentation. So maybe, is it okay if you just switch back? Yeah.
Well, yes. I hope it's okay. I can do it. Let's see. Stop share. Have I done it? Was I successful?
Yeah, you were successful.
Good. Okay. Great. All right. So I'm very good at wayfinding. I'm not as good at technology. So this is our sample that we sent along. And if you have it, pull it out because now is the time to really understand some of the details that we're going to review in full through our slideshow. So on the top, you can see there's a reflective panel here. This is not an accessible example because it has a high sheen. You can also see that it has tactile text. I can hold it on the side so you can kind of get a handle that it's got tactile text. Really great contrast, right? We've got white on black. And then we have Braille. The Braille is running off to the side here. So I can feel it because I'm holding it. It's harder to see because Braille doesn't have contrast. Braille can be the same color as the background of the sign. So if you've got yours, you should be able to see tactile and tactile on a shiny surface. Over on the other side, this panel here, we've indicated just some, not all, of the requirements for an accessible sign. So you can see that it has sheen, so that's not great. That it does have contrast, that's hitting the mark. It's tactile, yes, the letters are raised 1/32 of an inch for what it's worth. It is a serif font. So what we are looking for when we talk about serif and sans serif, you'll remember from last time, is whether it has that little tail on the bottom. Harder to read with your finger in that tactile way, right? You really have to consider how many nerve endings are in your finger and can you figure your way around a serif font? The answer is no. Mixed case, so uppercase O, lowercase letters, whereas down below we have a sans serif font, all uppercase. It is acceptable, but it's not best practice. So we've illustrated each. If you work your way through, you'll find that each option is at least explored once. And then on the back side of this sample, we've also included a legibility chart as well as color contrast, because these are two things that are just, they're measurable tools that we can always pull out. Harder to understand the contrast, so we've printed something that really helps to illustrate. There isn't a device, there isn't a measuring tape that we can use. Instead, you actually really have to understand color and contrast. And then you can see whether it's legible just using the power of your own eye. So that's the sample. If you didn't get one and you want one, let us know. You can just shoot us an email. All right, I'm going to try and share my screen again. All right. Am I live? Do you see me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so wayfinding, just as a refresher, is that entire process of receiving your appointment notice or knowing that you're going to a particular place for a meeting and finding your way there right out of the appointment reminder into your car or on the bus, all the way down the street as you spot, you've got eyes on the location, into the parking lot to where you park your bike or your car, through the right door. That entire process, getting to where you're going, is wayfinding, and signage is one element of it. As it relates to signs, we think of wayfinding in different tiers of priority. So we think about what signs are your immediate signs, and we generally will process this from outside in. This week, we're focusing just on interior. We will have some exterior examples, but we're focusing on the interior. So when we talk about interior wayfinding, we think about directories. So that might be the building, entire building, listed out in front of us. Now, we wouldn't put every single item that is inside of that building on a directory. We would whittle it down to the most important. So things that people who are coming to the building need to see regardless of who they are. If it's staff or if it's a first-time visitor, or maybe it's someone who's there to service the building, right? What are those key locations? Elevator directories get a little bit more specific because they'll tell you what's important on each floor. And then floor directories are even more specific. Now we can break down, we can use that small real estate to get specific about what is on that actual floor. Directional signs are the same, where we think about how much information can we put on there, how much can we remember as we move through a building, and we break them down into wall-mounted directional or overhead directional. Identification signs is the next category of sign types, and that could be anything from the name of the building to the name of the department to the name of the room or the name of the washroom, and all the way to the back of house, right? So maybe it's a mechanical room. All of these are identification signs. And the reason I'm breaking it out right now is because they are different. Every sign type has a different purpose. And so because they communicate different information, they generally communicate it to you at a different moment in your journey. So you might be stationary when you're reading an identification sign. You might need to see it from a distance, for instance. And so because each of them are different, the message is important and intentional to that sign type. Then there's two more sign types on the end here, which often people try to merge into, they do it across the board, into their different signs. So an environmental graphic would be an example of like a floor to ceiling mural, something that is intended to make the space feel memorable and special, but isn't necessarily communicating something, right? It might not be that it's the London room, right? Your boardroom is a particular room name, but that mural might illustrate it. And it's memorable now, right? So it becomes part of wayfinding. And then safety and regulation signs too are important sign types. That is, maybe the no smoking sign or a fire evacuation sign. So those are the different sign types. And you can see here.
Yeah, so we've got a couple images of a sign system that exists for St. Mary's. So that's something we've worked on, over the years. And this kind of top larger image is definitely, I would say, probably a building directory. So as you're entering, this would be right in the foyer or the mezzanine of a space, and it gives you a good overview of the building that you have just come into. And then these lower ones are probably closer to the identification style. We've got one on the left here. That's this global learning. That's probably more of an area identification, which is helping you understand the space that you're moving into. Maybe it's a suite of offices, or it's a larger room with some partitions or something like that, where you could have a further refined room ID supplementing this area ID. And then lastly, our image of the washroom is, a little bit more self-explanatory, but you're still, this is like the end result of a person finding their way to this space. So they've probably seen washrooms indicated on some overhead directionals, or perhaps even on that building directory when they entered. And like Allison said, I tend to think about, wayfinding as a bit of a funnel too, right? So as you are entering the building, you're kind of when you start your wayfinding journey, you're at the top of the funnel. So whether that's, like Allison said, when you get a notification on your phone about a doctor's appointment, or if it's entering the building. And then as you get kind of closer to your destination, you're moving down that funnel, and these different sign types kind of appear closer and closer throughout the funnel as you're getting closer to your destination. So a couple good examples there.
So a sign family, like what we just looked at, whether it's made up of all of those types or just some of those types, they should be cohesive, right? They should belong to a system. They should match the environment, and they should start to communicate that culture. So when you're thinking about your own wayfinding and how you want to communicate, not just how to go and where to go, you might also think about what part of your brand needs to be present there, whether that's represented in the logo. Typically, we don't put logos directly on signs. So what you'll see, I'm hoping you can see my cursor. We've got here a sign system that's designed for Infrastructure Ontario. This is the government of Ontario. They're building a P3, so a very large hospital in Northern Ontario. And no Infrastructure Ontario imagery or logos necessary, because when you're in the hospital, you know at that point where you are. What you do need is imagery and content that points you in the right direction. So this sign here, this is a zone directory. This is welcoming you when you enter a department, a large wing of the hospital. It has a Cree iconography top left that is used not like a logo, but actually like a wayfinding code, a cue, to help move you through a relatively straightforward built environment. I will say this hospital is very clearly organized, but still nice to have color code and a visual code to help move people through and give them that subtle cue. I'm going to point out also that the consistency across these signs is not only in its color and its font, but you can see it's also consistent in the typography. So we have 3 languages. It's trilingual. Across the top is the Cree alphabet, and then English translation of Cree, still in Cree language, but just with the the Roman alphabet, excuse me, and then English right across the bottom, followed by Braille. So that's consistent on all of their signs, whether it's the directory or identification signs, whether it's the overhead hanging signs, and even the welcome signs. So consistency we'll look at more closely, but just for the purpose of understanding what do we mean when we say wayfinding, we're talking really about a system that's thought out, fully baked. And that process looks like this. It looks like taking a space, breaking down the sight lines, understanding what the message is going to be, building the pictograms so that they are sensible and reflective of the culture. And that process, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, is at iCandy, it's informed by 4 pillars. So we think always about evidence-based design, accessibility requirements, the strategy of moving a person in and out of the building. And then lastly, we really want to make sure that there's a continual management plan. We want to know that in the future, the signs are going to be easily updated, whether it's because there's a name change or because the building evolves or something is damaged. We just want to leave every project that we touch in good hands so that it can be updated internally. Today, we're just going to focus on accessibility, and we want to break it down basically by code. So remember, we talked last time about working beyond code. What we want to show you today is the requirements, and we're going to illustrate them and then explain to you best practice on how you can really maximize it. So the first thing when we think about accessibility would be the symbol of access. And we talked about this last time, important to touch on it again. On the far left, we have the traditional, the international symbol where we have a person sitting upright. And then in the middle, someone who's racing off. And on the far right, my preferred pictogram, but certainly not the right one or the best one. All of these, though, are an opportunity to really reflect how you see accessibility. So in our language, not using the word handicap, for example, in our pictogram selection, maybe choosing one that shows independence. These are ways we can really elevate dignity. And as you start thinking about wayfinding and what a person feels when they show up at your space, whether it's interior or exterior, you want to look at it from their lens, right? You want to understand, what are they seeing? How do they need to get to where they're going? So the very first element of accessibility, as it refers to wayfinding, is 4.6.1. This is our first clause, and we will walk you through it, I think, probably in as easy a way as possible. The language that they write isn't super intuitive or accessible for what it's worth, but it is pretty easy to break it down. So what are we talking about when we say wayfinding? Consistent location. So when we put a sign up on in any built environment, we want to be consistent about where they're installed. The requirement is that it's predictable, really. That's the best practice. So what we can see, I'm going to use my cursor again. We've developed just a really simple way of communicating building entrance. So we have a main entrance to most buildings, a secondary, and even like a back of house kind of entrance to most buildings. As you come into the main entrance, you would want to see a building directory, something that is going to welcome you to the entire building. And consistently, as you have to make a decision about where you're going, you want to see something that is going to be directional. So that tells you what's left, what's right, what's straight ahead. Remember, we don't want to use arrows that are cornered or angular. We just want to think in really linear patterns, what's straight, what's left, what's right. As you come to an elevator, you really need to see, think about yourself getting off an elevator, a floor directory. So these kinds of rules, developing and establishing the rhythm of your building, what's required, where do I need to make decisions, where am I looking for more information? That's what will inform the consistency of your signs and where they're located. Another clause is that the sign needs to be installed in a place where it can be read, where it's legible. So for example, don't put your sign in a shadow. Don't put it next to a bright window where the reflection of the window is going to trick your eyes into seeing only the silhouette of the sign and not actually be able to read it. So this is a great example of that importance, right? Why is that a regulation? Why is that a clause? Because it really matters. It will impact the legibility. We have here on the right a couple of signs that are in shadow, and they meet the other wayfinding requirements. They're tactile. Well, not all of them. They're tactile. They have some contrast. I won't say that they're 70, and they're certainly on a satin finish. They're not highly reflective, but in their location,
their placement. In
this location, they're no longer accessible. So this is again just about the sign family. Do you want to maybe break down Dal?
I can talk about this.
Okay.
Yeah. So these are interior signs we've been working with Dal to develop. So we talked about a sign family a couple moments ago, and this is very much that. We've developed, a consistent look, a consistent feel. But the other part of the sign family is, like Allison spoke a moment ago, is being consistent with where they are being installed and how they are being installed. So we have, a standard for Dalhousie that is a sign is installed at this height on center. And we do our best to hit that. There's always, a little bit of deviation on site, especially when you're working in a big facility that exists already where, some exceptions might need to be made. But having that standard and having, making a consistent effort to make your sign system feel cohesive, even between the sign that is in the east wing and a sign that is on the west wing that you're never going to see next to each other. It's important to have those located, consistently on the wall so that anybody moving through the space knows where to look, knows where to feel, and can anticipate seeing guidance where they want it. So our next slide here is very kind of speaking to a similar effect, where less about the height on the wall, but the placement of a sign, specifically relating to doors.
Can you break down two for them? Maybe do this one, the typical plan view.
Yeah, sure. So we always want to be installing on the latch side of the door. I think last time we spoke about this a little bit too, but if our red indication here on the latch side, if you can imagine that on the other side, and you are a person who has been walking through the building and has found that sign and are standing in front of it to read it, or pausing to feel the sign to get a sense of where you are, and somebody comes through that door, not necessarily seeing you or knowing that you're there, that door can swing and hit you, which is nobody wants. But if it's on the latch side, you're out of that doorway, you're out of that clearance. So it just becomes a lot safer, both for the person trying to use the system and for anybody trying to move through the building. Especially, if you're in a hospital or something where, sometimes people are moving quite quickly.
But even in a small environment, so even in your own offices, as you're making your wayfinding improvements internally, you'll want to think about that clearance of approach, right? Making sure that someone can come up to your door, see who's behind the door, read it, whether it's an identification sign for an office or if it's an identification sign for a restroom, just to have that clearance and to be away from that swing, right? Not always possible, though.
Yeah.
Not always possible to put it on the right side. So let's do one more. Your pick, dealer's choice.
Well, let's just go to the opposite end here. This one on the far right, this lower one here. So lots of buildings, there are corridors where it's tight. There are setups that just, maybe architecturally are oddballs, and that's the kind of spot where it gets tricky, because you want to make the best decision for the sign placement and for the people using it, but you need to break your standard. So we do have, I'll say, like secondary or supplementary standards you can fall back to, but it becomes a little bit more difficult. So installing on the wall, I think, is always preferred to installing on the door. Just again, it becomes a lot more difficult to read something if it is on a door. Doors get propped open, things get placed, things get missed. So it's important to have that consistency in your system, but it is also important to have a way to fall back onto some sort of secondary knowledge that you can place a sign in a location and still have it make sense for the context, but not necessarily harming or being painful for a person to use it.
So in the CSA standards, they start with location, which is why we've started with location. Then they move into the design of the sign. So we're going to shift gears now from being in the built environment to designing your signs and how are they made? What do they look like? And they refer to this as configuration of signs. And the clause itself is really straightforward. They want for the signs to be made out of a glare-free, low sheen material so that you don't get that reflection interfering with the message. So this is a really great example, high sheen, in part because of the environment that it's in. We've got a large screen wall in behind. You can see that glass, and the sun is just coming right through. But if we had used a non-glare acrylic, there would have been less sheen. Similarly, the restroom, high sheen. It is tactile. It does have what it is required in terms of, information, pictograms. It doesn't hit all the notes, but it's really certainly not hitting the right note for sheen. Go ahead.
Yep. So again, another aspect is just having that when a sign system is working together, you have consistency in it, and you have information displayed kind of in the same way. So here we've got, again, two different signs from the same sign family that, are obviously related. They're obviously in the same facility. You have that understanding just looking at them. The kind of key piece of information is this upper portion that's on this painted or colored background. So you've got a suite number, you've got a washroom icon, and then you've got this confirmation almost of what the space is written underneath it. I don't think we can see it here, but our washroom signs do have Braille on them. So,
and so does this.
oh
Again,
yes, the 107, yeah,
hard
does
to
have it
spot
there.
it, but it's there. This is a local project. These are pieces of art that were painted by the residents of an adult living and learning facility. So the art was supplied to us by the residents, and we incorporated that into the background. So where this is very successful, we have our contrast, we have low sheen, we have tactile text. Certainly there's a rhythm, like Kelsey is describing. This particular clause is about building consistency. But something that we have also not spoken to in the CSA is a busy background. So it's beautiful and it's allowable, but it is busy. So from a best practice point of view, sometimes you have to bend some rules and you have to make some decisions about what your priorities are in your system. It was really important to these guys that the signs include that personal touch, and we're proud to have included it. And I think it's actually quite beautiful, but it certainly wouldn't be how I approach most of our sign packages with that busy background. This is maybe more standard, a really plain white background. We're incorporating of color and some iconography to introduce culture, but it's much more institutionalized and isn't always appropriate either. It is a cohesive and consistent system, so it satisfies that clause of the CSA and really is meaningful wayfinding. It is going to help a person move through the building with that sort of anticipation. They know what to expect. They know what to look for. The last clause of that section was that the sign needs to be luminance and contrasted with its background. So what does that mean? It really is about being in a space that it's visible, so there's some amount of lighting, and that it has contrast. So couldn't be any more contrasted than this sign, black sign on a white wall with white text. Really very unimaginative, but super, super accessible, very easy to read.
And just to add a thought here, so we talk about, contrast in a couple of different spots here, and it, feels a little bit repetitive or sounds a little bit repetitive, but there's, contrast in a couple different places that you're looking for, right? There's the contrast of the sign on the wall on the install location, and there's the contrast between the content of the sign and the sign backer. So it's not all about, the design of the sign, it's also about the context of the sign in the space.
Yeah, definitely. And the next class, characters. So not super intuitive when you read through this, like what is a stroke to width height ratio between 1 to 5 and 1 to 10. It's one of those things where you read and you start to have to get a graph paper out and start to illustrate it for yourself. There are a number of fonts that satisfy it right out of the gate, Arial, for instance. But let's look at more specifically, what are those requirements? So serif and sans serif, you'll remember, those of you who were here at the beginning, that on our sample, we illustrated the sans serif and the serif text in a tactile so that you can actually feel why this is important. Now, it is actually applied to all signs. It's not simply to the tactile signs, and that's for two reasons. One, consistency. So once you have established that you're using a sans serif font, and whatever that font might be, you want to apply it across all signs. But it's also important because it's easier to read. So not just with a tactile touch, but also visually, it actually takes just a little more time to differentiate. And for anyone who has cognitive or vision impairments, you will need and appreciate every effort that's made to make the sign visible, legible, and easy to understand. That also touches on the font size and legibility. This is, there are many, many charts available online. And you'll remember I told you that we partnered with Dalhousie to create a lab where we studied the legibility of signs, because though these charts exist all over the internet and have a lot of inconsistencies through them, we wanted to understand ourselves, what is the data? And so this is a very easy to read, easy to understand allowance. So follow this, screenshot it. It's also on the back of your sample sign. This will help you to understand someone in a static position, the distance that they're standing from the sign, and that letter height, what it might be. So this I would call is sort of a maximum. Certainly if you're moving, you want to make it bigger. You want to make some allowances for that. 4.6.4, pictograms and symbols. So as you're developing, do you want to talk about the culture of the space?
I guess I can, yeah.
Okay, you started to talk, so I thought I was cutting over you.
No,
Sorry.
I was just going to say we're coming back to contrast
Do it.
again.
Okay.
So again, I kind of touched on this a second ago, but you want your text to contrast against the back, or you want your pictograms to contrast against the back, and you want all of that stuff to contrast against the space that it's in.
And you want a field division. So
yeah.
So let's talk about that for a moment here. We don't have awesome, can you see it? Awesome contrast between the sign and the background. It's just not 70%, but the sign, pictogram, and the background of the sign do have contrast. It also has excellent field of vision, so that pictogram is inside of a protected space. It'd be all the more important if that background wall were a different color. Tactile signs. So the first three elements, I guess really the first two items of this clause, well, all three of them, is saying that every sign that is permanent, or that is a regulation sign, or that explains the rules and what's mandatory of a space should be tactile. It should have tactile text and have Braille. So if you think about our sign family types, remember at the beginning, I ran through all the different types. We had area identification or identification signs in general. So that would be a room sign or a washroom sign or a department sign. The sign that's at the entrance to your building would even be an identification sign. So all of those, because they're permanent, should be tactile and have Braille. But so too should a regulation sign and anything that is, explaining what's mandatory. So because we don't see these very often, I think it's important to pause and challenge yourself to think about what regulations, what requirements of my office environment or of our municipality or of this rec center, what do we need to communicate in a tactile way so that everybody has access to that? Now, I'll leave it with that. This is a very poorly photographed emergency evacuation sign inside of an elevator. But then what we do generally think about would be the room sign. So we do often have allowances in our own thoughts when we think about accessibility for permanent room signs. We might not be thinking directional. We might not be thinking back of house, but we should. We should certainly be thinking about those signs. Where the signs don't have to be tactile would be overhead signs, anything that's projecting off of a wall.
Things that are typically installed out of reach, out of the way anyway.
But they should still follow accessibility standards, and they don't always. So actually we'll just pop back. No, we're running out of time, I'm afraid, but I'm going to just take the minute to show between these two signs, you can see for yourself which one is more accessible, the one that's visible, right?
Yeah.
We've got
the one that's got the contrast.
Yes,
yeah.
There it is. Yeah. Unlike this gorgeous sign built for a retirement home, has the right palette, but it's blending with the background. So oftentimes designers are inclined to use a white sign backer. You'll see it all of the time. And what's unfortunate is designers also love white paint. So in this instance, what we have is a really bright sign that's installed on a white wall. So it does have contrast. But if this were a white background with a blue pictogram, it would be harder to see. So let's look at the character height. You can see really well inside of this slide here that the Braille, though it's the same color, it's very visible. We're always putting our Braille below the tactile text. It's usually closer together because as you're reading the sign, it's efficient movement. Over here, this is the Lunenburg Library, beautiful building with these gorgeous wooden custom signs that have both tactile text as well as Braille, satin finish, great contrast all the way around in the built environment as well as on the sign. Do you want to run through any of the measurements? They're not memorable.
Yeah.
Keep going. All right. Now the location of our tactile signs. So we did start our talk with just saying that as things are installed on the wall, you really want to make sure that you have that accountability for who's using the building. So who can you anticipate is going to be visiting and what will their requirements be? Because there is a span. You can install your sign generally at around 1,500 millimeters from the center of the sign to the finished floor, but there's room for it to move up and down. So in a school, I would say it's appropriate to lower it. And in any space that is going to be accessible to a child. So a rec center, for instance, would be a really great place to consider that a child will be using that space, primarily wanting to move through the school or rec center independently, and maybe from a seated position. And then we think too about that clearance of approach. So as you're coming up to a sign, you want to make sure that you have a good relationship with your staff and facility managers so that they don't place, say, a garbage bin or a pop-up banner or, you know, the trolley in front of their signs.
Especially, you know, you see that type of thing a lot in like entryways, foyers, mezzanines, that type of thing. Because there's, you know, people want garbage cans. People have things to get out of their pockets. Or again, like a roll-up banner or something. And a lot of times those things get placed really close to the other things that people are trying to access. So your big building directory. But once you put an obstacle there, it is an obstacle. And even if you're a person who's sighted and fully mobile, you know, sometimes you can walk through a space, and if there's a banner just at the right angle, you know, you miss the sign completely. And then all of a sudden you're on the second floor in the staff area and you're turned around and people are looking at you funny.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
We've all been there. And it really is, there's something to be said about that. The real estate, it's a wrestle that you have to be prepared for. So anyone who is responsible or has a relationship with facility management, it's so important to understand what kind of clearance of space do you need around all of your signs. And then you can build an expectation of policy that obstructions will not be left or even temporarily placed in front of a sign. And you can create like a 4x4 protected space in front of every sign. So challenging, easy to theorize, but hard to implement. That is the reality, but you have to start somewhere. And best practice would be to just keep your corridors as clear as possible. So we're going to have a quick case study. I invite anybody who is in the room to unmute yourself and tell me what's wrong with the sign. Anybody?
Low contrast.
What was that?
Low contrast.
Yeah, I can see that. Absolutely. So what we have is a parking space here. That is, you know, certainly we've got the horizontal paint. We've got a accessible symbol of access. It's backwards. The symbol of access is always a person pointing from left to right. A couple of more things that I'll point out would be that this arrow is pointing to both sides, and the requirements are that a sign actually should be placed in front of each spot. So here's an example of the solution. For every parking spot, symbol of access painted on the pavement, high contrast, as you pointed out. The sign itself needs to be tall enough that it reaches over the height of the cars. So that's why there's always going to be 1,500 millimeters from the bottom of that sign. You'll often see people try to cheat it, and they'll cut their telspar poles in half so that they can take one 10-foot length and break it into 2.5, but that's actually just too short. Now you've got SUVs or trucks that are parked in front of it and it's not visible. And it's actually safety as well as it is identification to know that this is an accessible parking space and that a person could be coming out of their vehicle at a lower position. So that's really something that you want to be protective of. And then also the contrast, like you said, you want to make sure that that sign is visible, blue, white, pictogram. This is another case study item. So we're just looking at a washroom sign, gender neutral. We know from our visit 2 weeks ago that just in terms of universal design and what is best practice, that the half man, half female pictogram has been rejected. It is not a symbol that is wanted to be used for a gender neutral or all gender washroom. And instead, we recommend using a symbol of a toilet and just clear, simple language, right? Leaving gender off of the sign altogether. We talked about cognitive ability 2 weeks ago. I didn't touch on it today, but I'm going to ask that you recall it a little bit. I was trying to describe to you how much information a person can recall in a moment. So as you're moving through a space and you're trying to remember where to go, what to remember, our brains are, very busy and always taking in so much information, including intuitive wayfinding. So what we don't want to do is set someone up with too much information to remember. And it is tempting. A lot of folks want to start with listing everything on their primary directory, but then it's overwhelming. It's not purposeful. You can't find even the destination because how is it organized? And so instead of putting everything up on top, what we recommend, this is the Oakville Hospital, what we recommend is a spatial cue. So providing a map of the space, even really simple linear spaces. Of course, we don't have hospitals as large as they do in Ontario, but we do have complex spaces, and we have also new buildings that are usually very linear. Even those buildings will benefit from having a map. Anything that shows the top down will help spatial learners like myself and linear learners like Kelsey. So Kelsey will identify really well to things being listed out in front of him. He'll read through, he'll understand his way just from the list, whereas I prefer to see things drawn out in front of me. And then we think of those signs in combination with providing additional directory information with arrows. So now we're providing directions on where to go. And remember, I talked about the arrow that points up. It does not mean that you're going up a floor unless it is at an elevator. So even here next to a set of stairs, this arrow would be representative of moving forward because it's in the hallway. Chaos. No, I'm sorry for the quality of that image, actually. That's not showing up very well. Very quickly, I want to remind you of all those sign types and point out that we don't like to combine them. So a directory should simply be a directory listing of the locations, and directional signage should just point where things are going. So this is a directional sign, but it's providing an awful lot of direction. When you have a lot of content to illustrate, we'd like to break it down into its direction. So I need to turn right. The sign would be placed at a location where turning right is obvious and intuitive. List what is that way, right? Rather than listing all of the things that it might be to the right, straight ahead, or to the left. So I hope those generic case studies have been helpful. I hope that the review of the CSA standards is useful as well, because though it is available and it's easy enough to look through and read, sometimes there's question about what do they mean when they say that the braille should be below the text, or what does it mean to read contrast in 3 different ways. And I think we've done a thorough job of illustrating it. But we always like to invite case studies, because the best way of really learning and understanding wayfinding and accessibility as it relates to us is to break it down. So I did suggest the last time we connected that if anybody had any samples or any examples of signs that are in your community that you are working on that you want to see, just to pop them up into the chat here. So another reminder, I do have 3 case studies that we're going to run through here. But if anybody has something they want to look at, just please pop it up. Do you want to run Victoria Park?
So this first one was submitted to us from Victoria Park in Truro. So these signs, there are signs already in place that exist that I believe are quite close to what's on the screen here. And the question was, is there a way we can design our park signs that hits, our accessibility goals, but also helps keeps the signs a little bit more subtle or blend into the surroundings of nature, into the natural environment. They don't want to take away from the natural environment. So you can see again the drafts that are already up, I believe, and there are definitely some things that are okay with these signs, and definitely some things that need work. So I would say right out of the gate, the greens and the browns are, fairly low contrast. The Explore Truro's Nature Victoria Park text is, difficult to read even just on these screen grabs here. The blue, the yellow, and the orange, I feel like are pretty good in terms of the contrast, but the text on those becomes a little harder to read. When they're paired with the green, it's nice, but then all of a sudden your text is disappearing. So a little bit of the balancing of our contrast becomes difficult. And again, these signs, like in nature, in the space, we're thinking about too. So a green and a brown sign pairs nicely against a background of trees, but it does become, maybe more difficult to see from 300, 400, 500 meters away. And when you're walking, out on a path, I'm sure we've all had that moment too of, am I going the right way? Am I still on the trail that I think I'm on? And when you can see, something from a distance that reassures you, you feel a lot better. So our next slide here.
Before we go on, I just want to comment on a couple of the things that are really strong and that I think you want to protect because you're doing it already and you're doing a good job of it. And that would be including the distance. So,
Yes.
so this is really helpful to anybody who has accessibility challenges or is just simply on a time crunch, right? It's nice to know how far of a distance it is. And what I would say is you could expand on that. So where you have your waterfalls labeled here at 760 meters, I would say along the way, it might be helpful to give them additional cues, right? That's been another 100 meters. And that could just be a simple small sign that just counts down how far to the waterfall. And then on the way back, have it be double-sided as well. And that's really well paired with a resting station. So if you have the capacity to think of wayfinding as more than just signage, and you can fit in maybe some benches along the way, interpretive signs at the benches so that when someone is resting, their kids or their colleagues or friends can have a look. I don't know why I was just on the trail with you. In my imagination, it was you and I, my colleague, can have a look at something else while they're waiting and resting together, right? It's that sort of companionship and keeping multiple people and their various needs busy and occupied and fulfilled. So that I think is brilliant, leaving of the meters in here. We've also used steps rather than meters because sometimes it's hard to visualize what is a kilometer, what is 1,120 meters, how far is it? And so with that, with thinking about steps, then you have to consider the type of person who would be using this trail. What is their gait? And another thing that I think is really beautifully done here is you do have your aerial view. It's a topographic map, so it gives an idea of what that incline is. You could indicate on these signs that it is, what that incline is, or even maybe your distance in approximate hours. Another thing that I think is brilliant and that I want to encourage everyone to notice is that there's a QR code, and that is really inexpensive technology and a brilliant way of expanding the information. I don't love technology. We've been over this just in terms of my inability to flip between screens. But why I don't love it is because I know we are so dependent on it. And I have children, so when we're hiking, I don't want them on their phones. So my preference is to not use phones in nature, but that is a privilege and it is not everyone's ability, right? So we really do want to think about how can we communicate things like distances and even information about the environment. And that QR code is a brilliant way of either putting something in their ears or making that information available to them through a website. So I think those are some really brilliant efforts, and I hope that you'll be able to build on what we've told you here. Back to the contrast though. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Alison, can I ask a question on the previous slide?
You bet.
So there's no braille or tactile on these signs. Is that correct?
That's right. These ones do not have braille or tactile, and that is a common, especially for something that was built 10 years ago, which was the timeline on these signs. You absolutely can make everything tactile now. So we could print the maps even so that they have that raised relief. You can have tactile text, tactile pictograms, right? There is no shortage with today's technology of how and where you can incorporate accessibility on that tactile front. Absolutely a good point.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. So Kelsey was talking about the contrast of the signs. Just something to consider is that when you have a green sign in a green environment, it is hard to see. This is the Nova Scotia Nature Trust, where they use this brilliant blue. So from a distance, you can spot it, and that gives you something to work towards. It gives you a beacon of hope. I'm almost there. Especially useful for any of the trail markers that might count down the distance to the waterfall or the distance to the loop back. This is a sign family that we designed for Ottawa area. This package was entirely based on getting people moving, making sure that everyone felt welcome to use this park. And so it did count the trail, it did provide measurements, it provided also rules and regulations, and everything is accessible, including the trail itself is tactile, right? It's printed with a 3D print. And this is we'll just move to this one. Another example of how you can provide informational content in a tactile way. It's durable. It'll last a long time, and it's color fast. But one of the things is something like this is quite expensive, unlike a print. So many different technologies for producing it. Traditionally, this has been the primary way of having accessibility standards met outdoors. You can see it's a brown sign in a brown environment. Again, it does blend, but blending may not be quite what you want to do. You might want to complement it. And so outside of signage, how you can introduce some accessibility would be to have that trail. You want to think about, what does the pathway look like? What is the edge of the pathway? And then what kinds of signs can you put out there? And by signs, I mean indicators that let you know you're on the right path. And so one really brilliant way is just using this rope system. It does have some tripping hazards, so there's always some pros and cons. And then including braille and tactile lettering right on these pieces here. So that lets a person know that they're still moving in the right direction and what the next amenity is that they're going to come across. Are there any questions for us here about this one? All right, we will move on to the Lunenburg Community Center. Thank you so much for this. Do you want to do a run through of what the questions were?
Yeah, so I think for this one, it was mostly the fact that there basically is no interior or exterior wayfinding kind of system in place, but that's something that they're looking to develop, which obviously we are very, very on board for. Yeah, so great idea. So, you know, an exterior of your building, you've got obviously signage, but nothing that is, you know, super cohesive or you've got kind of all the standard stuff, I'll call it, right? Your parking, your civic, your kind of building sign.
And then also really beautiful artwork across front. So that environmental or experiential graphic has been applied here as well. But it's still hard to know where you are. So if you imagine yourself as a first-time visitor trying to get to the rec center, you wouldn't necessarily know that this is the building. I have a feeling that most people in Lunenburg know it's the building because they've been there before, and it's become just a part of their experience. It's not because there's signage. And so good work just in terms of identifying that there is a lack of signage and a lack of wayfinding. Now, how do you implement it? So let's have a quick look. First thing we would suggest is that you put that beacon up on your building. Give people something to call the building from a distance, something to look at as you're approaching, something to identify that primary entrance. So this single sign does accomplish all of that. It's got a name, you can see it from far away so you know where you're going. And then once you're right upon the building, it's helping you to see where the entrance is, because the entrance is painted blue. In a field of blue, it is somewhat difficult to identify, certainly as a first-time visitor, but then when you add to that too, someone who's maybe has cardiacs and they have a hard time seeing contrast, they have a hard time seeing and making out forms. So up here, we have really large lettering that is, it's one of those spaces that's a bit challenging. You do have some challenges because of the colors that are already incorporated on the building and the span of the building, but you have a lot going for you as well. And so I would maximize on those opportunities where you have illumination, you have a large building facade. Lots can be done here without necessarily even a large budget. Before I move on, I should point out too, just keep in mind that your parking signs should be at the parking spot directly. I know that it's right here on the other side of the ramp, but they should be freestanding. I also know and recognize that freestanding signs are problematic themselves, especially in winter. They're an obstruction for plows. But putting them on the building actually is not a sign to the person who's parking. So I'd be very cautious about that and may require some creative thinking in terms of how can you correct the signage as it relates to parking. As an example, we have here the Pictou County Wellness Center with their large sign across the top. They have a beautiful ribbon. This is one of 3 signs because this building is visible from the highway. You want to see it as you're coming up the side road as well. And then they have the same scenario where they've got parking in this instance, it's in the middle of the parking lot. And they are accommodating that signage there just with a freestanding sign. So that illustrates what I was just trying to describe. once you move into this building, it is chaotic. There's a lot of movement just in terms of, what's fighting for my attention. Things are on the wall. There's a lot of the pattern across the floor. So simplifying some of the noise that is inside of this built environment will be your first step to improving intuitive wayfinding. Once you've cleaned up the space, maybe that looks like taking down or isolating, changing some of the orientation of the communication boards. Once you've tidied up the space a little bit, then you can start with some of the directional signage. So a building directory lays out the entire building, identifies what's inside of it, both with a map, something that shows you spatially what's there, and then a list of destinations. For example, you shared with us also your directional sign. I think this may be a mock-up and not a sign necessarily. Mm-hmm. What I would like to suggest here is that we think about the contrast, both in terms of the color as well as the color against the wall. So the sign background, the wall background, but then too, the wire frame versus a solid pictogram. So using that toilet for the washrooms is the right idea. But let's use something that's solid in its color so that it's easier to spot. And it's hard to really know what the stage access sign is. So when we think about pictograms, we usually are drawing from an existing standard, and then we start to, from that existing standard, tailor them a little bit further to communicate culture. Certainly, there are many opportunities to fully design and develop something, but I would ask just that you pause on that one and ask yourself, is it necessary? Do we need to put this symbol? Is it helping anyone? Definitely pictograms that show people in a particular action will help to communicate what the item is. For stage access, I don't know that I would recommend any pictogram myself. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just going to follow that up with, for me, so you can think about your building space, again, who's using it. So me as a visitor who hasn't been here before, I definitely want to know where the gymnasium is. I definitely want to know where the washrooms are, and maybe I want to know where the weight room is. I don't necessarily care about where the maintenance is, and a person who's looking for the maintenance room probably knows where the maintenance room is probably a facilities person.
I'm surprised to hear him say that.
So I would also maybe consider, do you need maintenance room on this sign? Because it's not something that, an everyday person is going to be looking for. Certainly a room sign for it, like you've shown us here on this other image, makes total sense. And that room should be labeled. But I don't know that it's one that needs to make the cut onto your directional sign, especially when you can use that real estate for some other things.
So what Kelsey is talking about is prioritizing your destinations. And why it took me aback on the maintenance is because I always like to think about, what is the destination and what's required to be on the building sign. And you're absolutely right. Maintenance should not be on your primary building sign. That would be a tertiary sign, right? That would be probably not something that everybody needs to know, but certainly those who do need to know, they should get there with guidance of signage. So it will make some of the directories, some directional signage, and most definitely it's going to be labeled on the door. The use of pictogram, I think, it's a good idea. It's not necessary. And we can certainly talk with you more about what does that pictogram look like so that it's meaningful and really intuitive. But you've got the right pictogram for the weight room and also the fitness studio. I think that's clever as well.
Can I jump in again, Allison, for one sec?
Absolutely.
So yeah, on the previous screen. It seems to me, so also the gymnasium pictogram is kind of confusing to me. There's just like too much going on. But when I look at this, I find, first of all, that the kerning of the letters, the tags, that it seems too squishy. And then of course, fitness studio is in a different size. They all kind of look like they're in different sizes, like weight room looks different to maintenance. And then I agree with the wire line versus the, kind of the filled in line at the kitchen. So when I look at this, and my brain sees it all, the the pictograms are also colliding with the arrows. So I'm getting very confused. Like my eyes have to go all the way from the left to the weight room, then all the way to the right to this
Oh,
arrow, which makes me go back left to the weight room.
yeah.
So I find this very challenging and very busy.
So one way that you could correct that would be to list all of your arrows on the far left directly next to the word. And then to finish with your pictograms, they could themselves be over where the arrows are. Just moving things around, you're absolutely right, does clean it up. And that different font point, we know why it's smaller. We can see that he was trying to fit it into this confined space. Maybe the built environment defined how tall the sign could be. I couldn't say. But the effort is great. The effort just in terms of wanting to include access for all of these places, and also a lot of effort to come up with pictograms that are descriptive. But I think we want to simplify, right? So ease up a little bit on how much information you're putting on the sign, and then simplify the pictograms as well. And really great feedback, Julie. Just trying to think about how best to represent it so it's one movement of your eye and you're not having to bounce back and forth.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I think that was great. This is an area identification sign. We just chose some signs consistently from the Pictou County Wellness Center to show you the full sign system and how they dealt with it. Labeling of the ticket area. So as you get to your kitchen, for instance, maybe putting simple text that is easy to read from a distance. And then two, I wanted to share this is a really easy and inexpensive approach to putting multiple signs on a confined space. So you can see how clean it is because they've got a really dark background, white vinyl, a simple arrow. Family doesn't say change rooms. It could. I don't think it takes away from the sign to add that. And then here on a separate sign, but in proximity to the identification and directional sign, you've got your regulations. And lastly, a donor sign. So I'm flipping back in my memory of the entrance and how much content was there. As you move through your building, you will find other opportunities where you can share additional information. And this is a really smart way of incorporating lots of info in a small space so that it's still clean and easy to get up into. I don't feel resistant of this space. I'm actually intrigued and want to get closer. The last, and for those of you who have to go, I apologize, we're running over, but we'll fly through this one, I think.
Sure.
The town of Wolfville. Julie, is that okay if we keep going?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. So we were asked about the restrooms here. We've got language that was provided to us. So restroom, not washroom. And I think that's, a nice subtlety is to understand what language is important to you. So these are the restrooms in Wolfville currently. I'll have a closer look, I think. Can I zoom in? I don't know if I can.
No.
Hopefully you can see that there's currently a sign on the door. There's a no smoking sign, no parking sign, informational signage here that says if you need more information or if you need help that you can call this number. And then again, an accessible sign here on this door. Now, and a washroom sign. Thank you, Kelsey, for pointing that out. Now, these accessible signs don't necessarily tell me that behind those doors is a restroom. We've somewhat, what have we done? We've associated the symbol of access with the washroom a little too much in North America. We've gotten really comfortable with seeing the symbol of access and thinking it's one of two things. It's either a parking spot or it's a washroom, but it's not. What it means is it is an accessible space. And so we want to make sure that our washroom signs indicate the toilet, and you've done a great job. This is the sample that was provided to us. And so absolutely, you want to have a toilet represented there and a symbol of access. You want to identify what the room is. You've done so with the word restroom. That should be tactile and have Braille. And that is your washroom sign. Just those items of information. Once you mix into it additional information like the no smoking sign or even the logo, you're now putting more content on that sign than what is really needed to know what's behind. So a couple of things that we would want to do here is we'd want to make sure that the signs themselves are simplified. Again, we would recommend that you use not the wire pictogram, but a solid pictogram so it has contrast. I would beef this symbol of access up a little bit myself. There are many that are available online you can grab. You can also shoot us an email. We can send you over a vectorized format of another. Up here, we have a restroom with an arrow. You can't quite see it, but it does have an arrow. And I would say that's not a necessary detail because it is identifying exactly where the restrooms are. So we only want to use arrows when we're pointing people away from a spot. So keep going is what the arrow means. Go in that direction. Now, of course, the washroom is right there, so you don't really need an arrow, but what you do need is something that's visible from a distance. And because it's Nova Scotia, our skies are not always blue. And I would say that a white sign may not be the most visible sign. So instead, what we would recommend is that you use your colors as a representation of your logo. So you're using of that teal rather than incorporating the logo directly into it. It's informing the design. We've got a solid form toilet. We have the symbol of access in a beefy way, so it's very visible. And I would use this sign here on the left as your projecting sign. Just simple, just that information. This would be your door identification sign. So it has all the information that we need on it. I do think you still need a separate sign. Now, I wouldn't put your no parking, no smoking, and report problems all on one, but you could get two messages, the no smoking and the report problems, onto this. The no parking sign, I think, should be used as paint, and it should be directly on the ground as the hazard lines, or it could be on the curb with an aluminum pole and maybe a base plate that you can drill directly into the curb. I generally do not encourage people to put their parking signs on the building face because that's a different spot. When I'm parking my car, I'm not scanning the buildings to see what they're telling me. I'm looking at the curb and I'm looking at the asphalt. Right? That's the immediate environment that I look to get information. And that is universally what people do. So parking signs should come off buildings, should be directly in the area where people are tending to park. And that's where you give the restrictions. So what that looks like is this. We have an easy to identify sign from a distance, installed at a height that is going to allow your snow plows to clear it, right? We want to be nice and high. But you also don't want it to be so high that you don't see it, right? As you approach these signs, they're harder to spot. You don't want to crane your neck. We've moved the signs so that they're not on the door, but they're instead on the wall. Now, this is the latch side of the door, but there isn't room. So here's an instance where we would follow those rules of where do you go next? And we wouldn't go to the door next. Instead, we would go to the opposite side of the entrance, and that's safe because this door is not going to open out. Over here, we're able to fit it onto the latch side, and then we would have just one single sign indicating that smoking is not permitted, and then also providing that supplementary information about who to call if you need help. That's our last slide. Anybody have any further questions for us? Did we lose everybody?
Yeah, there you go. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Allison and Kelsey. That was really great.
You're very welcome.
I don't know. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, please take yourself off mute. Now is your time to ask. And we do have a few comments in the chat here. So Curtis from Lunenburg thanked everybody for the feedback and suggestions. And just to note that they also find it cluttered, but wanted to use it as a starting point. Certainly,
Yeah, great.
Designers, and that they will be in touch to discuss more in depth.
Wonderful.
Sana said exactly. I wanted to comment that logos occupy a lot of space on the signs as they should not be, as they are not as important as the info we want to present. Amanda said, thank you for talking about Victoria Park in Truro. We have thinking to do. And other folks are chiming in to say that this was very informative and lots of useful information. So yeah, really, really great. Yeah, nice kind of encapsulation of the CSA standards. And also really love to see those examples, those live examples.
Yeah. Deb Ryan here. I do have a question. And I've seen washrooms, I've seen restrooms, and I see comfort stations. And a lot of people who are just Normal folks don't even know what a comfort station is. So if you're recommending to a municipality, what is there any language that consistent we should be providing?
Yes, we consistently recommend washroom. So comfort station is a lot of words to put on a sign. So remember that we are oftentimes dealing with that real estate tug of war, right? That we saw inside of Curtis's front entrance. There's a lot of clutter. So we generally like to simplify the message so we can get the right size on the wall. So washroom is very concise. Restroom is a lovely way of saying washroom, and everyone understands that a restroom has a toilet inside of it and a sink. So it does the trick as well. It's not as frequently used. So that is one of those beautiful places where you get to make a decision about how you want to refer to it. Right? Restroom feels a little bit more intimate than a washroom, and so you can choose what language works best for you. Comfort station is informative. It tells you, that it's maybe a little more looks, but it doesn't define clearly that it's a washroom. Could mean that there's a change table inside of it, and then I would ask, is it accessible? Is it an adult change table? So it's open-ended.
And I would say too, Deborah, that the language isn't clearly, like Allison just said, it's not clearly defined one way or the other, but what you should be doing is being consistent across all of your signage. So just as an aside here, I know, again, our work at Dalhousie, they had a lot of things labeled as washroom and decided they wanted to start calling things restrooms. So we've been, even kind of training some of the Dalhousie staff that we deal with, saying, they'll be saying, oh, the washroom, and then they'll catch themselves and say, oh, it's restroom now, it's restroom. So kind of developing that consistency is really important. Whatever way you choose, be consistent.
Mm. That help, Deb? In that too, like, we talked a little bit about the beginning for symbols for gender neutral washrooms. So sometimes the gender neutral washroom will not be the accessible washroom. So do you have recommendations for pictograms for gender neutral washrooms that are not necessarily accessible?
Yeah, so a gender neutral washroom is just simply the toilet, right? It would just be the pictogram of the toilet, and across the bottom it would simply say washroom. Now this is an easy answer, but where it gets interesting, and what I'm working on right now for our national standards, the next update of the CSA, is that we want to actually be more specific in our verbiage. So, for example, accessible washroom is what we're saying to one another to understand that that washroom has a toilet with the proper clearances and radius turning. What we do in a sign is we generally just show that with a pictogram of access, but it doesn't say the word accessible washroom. So we'll actually start turning that boat now to include the language accessible washroom. And whether that's a gender neutral washroom or if it's a male or female or staff washroom. So now it gets wordy again, which is the challenge. And maybe another reason to avoid adding language like comfort station, because we do want to start getting specific about, is it an accessible comfort station? Is it an accessible male comfort station? Is it an accessible staff only comfort station, right? So once you get into those specifics of what is this room, what are the regulations around it, and how accessible is it, then maybe you start to whittle down on the language and mirror what is in the pictograms with the text. So if it's accessible in its symbol, allow for it to say accessible, a lot of letters, accessible washroom. Unfortunately, then you add an additional language, French, for instance, and your sign becomes quite tall. So this is the tug of war, and why we work with designers, because they are problem solvers, right? They see the challenge and then they figure out how do they make it work so it's legible still. Any other questions? Okay, there's something here. I just wanted to ask a question about how the entrances of a park or trail, how do we want to make entrances accessible? I'm not sure if accessible entrances matter, I'm not sure how challenging entrances are. Okay. Well, Sana, I would invite you to unmute yourself if you wanted to pipe up and as I answer, because I think I understand what you're asking. I think you're saying, how do we identify the entrance of a park and whether it's an accessible park or not? So let's imagine that we are driving down a rural, I see it there.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Do you want to describe the entrance to us?
Sometimes I was just thinking like people have no idea, for example, a park or a trail are equipped, accessibility, or sometimes the entrances are not really clear, or I'm just thinking about the people that they have visual impairment. So I'm not sure if they are challenging or not. So this is what I wanted just to ask you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you're right. So accessibility is so broad, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about building access, we're talking about making the space available and easy to enjoy to anybody, regardless of their abilities, regardless of their cognitive or visual or like their hearing. We want everyone to have access to it. So how do you identify that? Generally is through the sign, and that's why we will work in a variety of mediums, even on the signage, so that it's tactile, so it has the contrast, and maybe the QR code so something can come into your ear. At the park entrance, here's what I would suggest is that as you're approaching the park, we generally expect to see a sign on the road indicating that we're getting closer. So it might say like 300 meters, turn right. That sign does not need to have a symbol of access on it. That should be an identification sign that is telling me I'm approaching my entrance. But then once I get to the park entrance, I want that beacon to be really clear and really welcoming. So certainly the principles of accessibility that we've described so far should be applied to all of those signs: contrast, letter height, the font choice, right? Those elements all should follow the guidelines. I turn into the park now, and I want to know where I'm going to park my car. And it takes me more time, it takes me more space to get out of my car. So I want to see that there is a space reserved for me that's large enough for my side loading van to open up. And I want to also know that it's a safe space. So maybe there's clearances that are identified all the way around it so that people other than myself are aware that that's a space for me. So that would be, outside of signage, a way of really making it clear that it is an accessible park. And then from there, you might start pointing. Let's say the entrance is different for someone who's going to access it with a stroller, or someone who's going to access in a wheelchair. So if you have two different points of entry, you want to really celebrate the one that is accessible and make that your primary entrance. Sometimes they're out of the way, and so you have to reconfigure and design. And this is why signage is so fantastic, because it's one of those quick ways of improving accessibility by virtue of giving information. It's not always possible to reconfigure the entrance. It is always possible, however, to point people to it in a way that is loud and proud and clear so that everybody sees it and understands what that space is for. Does that make sense?
Yes, a lot. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
You're welcome. Anything else? Guys have stuck in with us 20 minutes over our allotted time. I appreciate you and everyone's interest. I think it's just so exciting that people know what wayfinding is. I think it's exciting that people are interested and motivated to make accessibility improvements. And Kelsey and I, we are colleagues. We've worked together for 7 years.
7-ish, yeah.
And we welcome any opportunity to talk further about how we can inject some access and meaningful accessibility into your environment, whether it's outdoor or indoor. Give us a call.
Yeah. And like once you are thinking about accessibility and, looking for it, like turn that part of your brain on as you're just like moving through your day over the weekend. And you will see stuff that is like really abysmal, and you'll see stuff that's really great. And like once you start, again, just paying attention and looking for that type of stuff, you'll be surprised at how many, different things you see. And again, not just signage, all kinds of different things. Yeah.
Solutions. And that is a sort of an attitudinal thing, right? As you're learning and taking in these lunch and learns and coming up with solutions for accessibility, or even starting to identify what does access look like and what is a barrier, then you start to engage the world and see, oh, look at that, that's a solution. And it's like that creative ability to take something that's a problem for you now that you may have not noticed was a problem and make it better for everyone. I think that is just so awesome and should be awarded. Yeah.
Cool.
Any questions? Get on with our days, everybody.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Allison and Kelsey. I really appreciate your time. And thanks to everybody who contributed some examples and some questions. Really fabulous to have you both here with us for these 2 sessions. If I field any more questions from people, and I expect that I will, maybe we can discuss another session further down the road, if that's
Absolutely.
appropriate.
I do see that Lisa has a question here asking if our slides will be available. Our slides are not super intuitive to move through and to communicate all of that information. So we actually don't publish them. But what we are is we are willing. So if you would like for Kelsey and I to speak with your committee or your team, by all means, we're happy to make this information available. I just wouldn't do it but as simply as handing over the slides, because I just don't think that would do the trick. But absolutely, we're willing to help communicate.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right.
So have a
Take
wonderful
care.
day, everyone. Thanks for coming out, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks.